Coleman Dennehy. I've been working here at Dundalk for the last few years. I suppose just to give you a little bit of background, I finished my PhD on kind of administrative history of early modern Ireland, got about 14 years ago now, and I was looking for a new challenge, I suppose, and I ended up taking an interest in criminology, contemporary criminology, modern criminology, where I spent a couple of years working on the modern Irish sex industry and the law and how that works. And my idea was to take modern concepts of crime and theories of and sociologies of criminology and try and apply them backwards into the past and see if maybe we could take some of the ideas and the theories from today and see how well they might work in the past. And so some of the work I've been doing recently has kind of featured and focused on how we might make more sense of crime and how that works in early modern Ireland. I focused more or less from around about the mid to late 1400s up until about 1700 or so. There's no set time periods for how crime works in Ireland. The sort of automatic cut-off dates that we've traditionally used in early modern history aren't really all of that relevant, although I will point you to a couple of important points in time that I think are worth concentrating on. And the talk today is on justices of the peace. These are local enforcement agents, amateur policing figures, quasi-judicial figures who in theory operate all around the country in every county. And they are, I think, at the coalface of the state's efforts to control the local population. So whilst I will be talking, as is traditional for early modern Ireland, about things like state building and differences between people based on their ethnicity or their religion, I'll also be trying to push that to the side a little bit and maybe think about Ireland more about around ideas of class and social control, because I think ultimately that is what the origins of crime and criminal policy may be about in Ireland, as is probably the case around the rest of Europe at the time. The image that you can see in front of you is a warrant to make one Patrick Richard Dennehy a Justice of the Peace for County Waterford from 1913. For the purposes, as you can see on the bottom right of the screen, I've entitled the collection the Archivium Dennehiensis, the Dennehy Archive, which consists of a small leather suitcase that I found in a skip outside my mum's house, containing this document and a few other choice documents, some leases especially from the Lismore estate, between my family and the great Earls of Cork, Duke of Devonshire. They still have an ongoing issues with local fishermen in the river. But I'm just after finishing a transcription of a very large 6-volume diary of the first Earl of Burlington, so the same family. So it's a neat little trick between the both. And I think that suggests that my family once upon a time were considered to be respectable in the locality, and maybe people on the upper fancied themselves as gentry. I did inquire from an old grandaunt to find where the money was now, if it ever existed. And she suggested that kind of slow horses and fast women did for most of us, and it's not to be found around the place anymore. The idea, I think, behind the local justices of the peace was essentially the establishment of people of authority, and I mean that in every sense of the word. They were vested with legal authority, but they also had some sort of kind of moral or a sense of authority within their community. People who could be the interaction between the state, which is largely faceless and based primarily in Dublin, and then the real activity of local state building, whereby our concept of the law and what the law is and how this is communicated to everyday people in everyday localities becomes very important. Do you know? Consider the idea that dates I'll be using will be in the 14th and the 15th and the 16th century for this talk, that an awful lot of people in Ireland did not understand the English language, certainly didn't read it, did not have any concept of what the intricacies of the law might be. They probably had a fairly good idea of what you can do and what you can't do, same as most of us today. I warrant that most of the people, either at home or here in the room, don't have an expert working knowledge of criminal law, but we understand fully what we can legitimately or reasonably undertake and do in our lives, what's more or less right and what's more or less wrong. And it kind of I suppose to a certain point it sort of equates very closely with our broad concept of right and wrong, or what is moral or ethical to do, more or less. There's always occasional little things like, is it really, it's criminal maybe to be caught with a joint, but is it actually wrong to smoke one or not? Maybe, maybe not, it depends perhaps. And there's other things that are perfectly legal, but we might all agree is an immoral thing to do. But more or less our concept and the way the state and society works is that there has to be general agreement on what is a reasonable thing to do and what is an unreasonable or an immoral thing to do. And I think that's the only way that criminal law will ever work, if the community genuinely agrees how that goes. And so part and parcel of making the criminal law work in late medieval or early modern Ireland is the necessity of bringing the community along and getting agreement between the general community of Ireland, and we'll talk for a minute on what that might be, and what the law actually is, and can they come to an agreement. And all of this takes place within the constraints of a state building exercise, the creation of a new Kingdom of Ireland, formally brought in law from the 1540s onwards, but a process of building Ireland in the image of England, creating a little England. This is what colonies and plantations are essentially about. It's about converting Irish people into English or British people, taking on British or English values, taking on a British or an English religion, morals, manners, ethics, ideas about what is civil behaviour and what is barbarous behaviour. And the criminal law for me is an integral part of that process. That ultimately the law, be that a civil law around land ownership or criminal law about what is considered decent behaviour or indecent behaviour, is part and parcel of that plantation project and part and parcel of, to quote a number of historians in recent years, making Ireland modern or making Ireland British or making Ireland English, about how you change Ireland from what English commentators consider to be a barbarous state into a civilised state. And the trick here is that ultimately the English state engages in some of the most barbaric behaviour in order to create what they consider to be a civilised, I'm using with magic quote marks all the time, to create what they consider to be a civilised state. About Ireland's legal heritage, this for me is one of the real perfect moments in legislative history to explain to, say, my undergraduate students how this might work. Very conveniently, these three very special acts in relation to Ireland, its relationship with England, and the generation of its criminal law converge in one singular parliament held in 1495 in not the county of Louth, but the county of Drogheda, what's called Poynings Parliament. Drogheda, of course, is a borough town, so it constitutes a county all of itself. And so it's criminal justice. It doesn't have, in the same way, the assize of the travelling justices, but it has its own within its own sense. And the first act there says that an act that no parliament beholden in this land until the acts be certified first into England. This is, according to our former Attorney General, an act that most people don't know about anymore in Ireland, but was taught to him as a child in primary school, or so he claims. That was Michael McDougall. This act essentially says that if the Irish Parliament want to pass legislation, from this point onwards, they need to send the legislation in advance over to England for approval. It's then sent back to the Irish Parliament, where it's put before the House of Commons, the House of Lords. They can pass it, they can reject it, but they can't amend it. And what it's doing is essentially establishing a layer of control over the Irish Parliament. It's governing by remote control, essentially. It means that the Irish Parliament, ultimately, as it pans out, it might not originally have been the original intention, but ultimately, as it pans out, it means that the Irish Parliament can't go on too much of a solo run, that ultimately they can always be controlled to some extent or another by England. The other act on the far right-hand side suggests that all acts an act confirming all statutes made in England up to that point, up to the point of 1495, become good in law in Ireland. Essentially, it's a mass transfer of legislation from the English state over to Ireland. Now, if you understand law, you'll understand that there's statute law created by Parliament, but there's also the common law, which in theory goes back to a time immemorial. And it's a law made up of tradition, a little bit of folk law in there, and a series of precedents that are set. So sort of judge-made law, or law that develops out of the courts from previous judgments that had been made. So to a certain point, Ireland had that common law tradition anyway, but it also now made it such that all public law from England becomes part of Ireland. So we've got English social control on one hand, we've got the law being replicated in Ireland, so again as part of this process of creating an English kind of an Ireland. And then bang in the middle, we have a very strange act, and this one always caught my eye when I was a postgraduate, I always made to come back to it. And this act suggests that an act whereby murder of malice pretense to spade treason. This means that premeditated murder, what we'd consider murder today as opposed to a manslaughter, is all of a sudden created in 1495, is made treason. Now the difference, the law categorises generally three kind of categories of crime. We've got misdemeanours, what today we would kind of punish in the district court, very local, relatively, I don't want to say innocuous offences, but the more minor sort of offending that can be dealt with in a relatively smaller court with relatively lighter punishments. Above that sits the felony crimes, and in Ireland in the early modern period, most felonies are punishable by death. Okay? Treason is the most serious sort of crime. It's traditionally, I suppose, what converts into a modern parlance of something like offences against the state. Things like killing a monarch, obviously, killing a diplomat, killing a member of the royal family, having intimate relations with the daughter of a king or the wife of a king, because it alters the fundamental line of monarchy, because it's an inherited status. And if you are having intimate relations with the Queen or the Princess of Wales, you are in effect risking that, you know, inherited status of primogeniture. And it also affects things like killing a soldier or killing a judge. Now, what's the difference? You're going to die anyway with a treason or with a felony. The difference is that with a felony, you're hanged. That's a simple process. You're simply taken to a tree or a gallows. You're climbed up a ladder. Somebody puts a rope around your neck. They pull away the ladder, and you strangle to death. It's not a long drop like we have. It's actually an Irishman who invents it. A geologist or a botanist in Trinity College. He's from Carlow, who invents the drop. You know, where you have a calculation of body weight versus the length of the rope and the distance to fall through. So it's a miserable, pretty death. Treason is much worse. If you've seen the Braveheart movie at the end, that's the punishment for treason. And that means that you're dragged to a place of execution on a hurdle. It's a little kind of a wicker platform that you're dragged along the street. People are probably maybe screaming things at you or throwing things at you along the process. You're taken up onto the scaffold. They put you lying down. They cut you from your private parts all the way up to your neck. They pull your innards out like a long line of linked sausages, and then they take out your heart, and then they cut your head off, and then they cut your body into quarters. They hang you up for a short time before they cut you up to the point that you're uncomfortable but not yet dead. And that's the hanging, drawing, and quartering. So what it's saying is in Ireland, and they literally say, the detail is there, that in recent times people have never taken the punishment for murder seriously. A hanging, it's like something out of Monty Python's, it's not that bad. So what they do in Ireland is that they enforce an extra harsh punishment for these sorts of treasons. So what they're saying in one instance is, we want to make you just like England. You're going to have the exact same law of England, and at the exact same time they're saying, we're going to actually stipulate a much different law from what you have in England. So at one point they're saying, be just like us, but at the other point they're saying, we're going to treat you very differently at the same time. And to me, that's the absolute nutshell of the law, England and Ireland, and ideas of civility and barbarity that we see emerging in early modern Ireland. It's not the same. They're not creating a replication of England. It would never work anyway. Ireland's different. It's got different religious setup, different social setup. Its environment is different. Its countryside is different. Its agricultural system is different. Its economy is very different. It's very difficult to replicate one culture directly onto another. But there's never a genuine attempt to do so when you see acts like that in the middle part. And that treason law, by the way, is extended to lots of other issues as well. Burning crops in the field, setting fire to somebody's barn, setting fire to somebody's house. These are not treason by what anybody kind of would sensibly think of as a treasonous act, either today or back in the early 1500s when those acts are propounded. And it's very interesting in that sense. Now, the creation of the Justice of the Peace is essentially taking what is traditionally an English office and stamping it and applying it simply onto Ireland and seeing if it will work. And again, there's questions in my mind about how well it might or might not work. Ireland is different, like I say. It's kind of not nearly as urbanised. Sure enough, in the English areas of the Pale, where we are now, Meath, Dublin, places like that, little coastal strip maybe in East Ulster, and maybe some urbanised parts of Munster, you know, around the cities of Limerick and Galway and Cork, but otherwise we're not seeing a huge urbanised sort of areas without that legal tradition and without that sort of strong connection to England along the way. But the legislation that's created, the office emerges kind of naturally according to the common law. Like I say, the administration of Ireland is largely modelled on that of England for the most part, but we do see in medieval legislation many examples emerging of statute law to create offices or to define what the role of the Justice of the Peace should be. As early as 1366, an act similar to one in England, roughly around the same time, is enacted for wardens of the peace in each county, 4 of the most substantial men in each county who are to undertake an assessment of military service and who are to keep the peace and to attach and commit rebels or wrongdoers along the way. That's essentially, in a nutshell, the role of the Justice of the Peace: to keep the peace in the locality, to make sure that the King's law is observed, and that they should be local people. And by substantial, they mean people who have wealth and who bring with that wealth sort of prestige, that need, I suppose, just like the way we think in the modern day of how we understand the role of maybe a local guard traditionally in Ireland, or maybe a judge, that they should be people of upstanding sort of reputation in the community, that if you're dispensing justice or if you're having to maybe arrest somebody, that you should be a person of sort of reliability within the community. And I think this is something that they try and bring across around about this point. In 1410, that's the original Act below from 1366. It's French, but not as we know it in many respects. It's what's called Norman French. So it's kind of an ungrammatical, just plainly translated version of French. It's how law is written for the most part in medieval Ireland, up until around about, again, the end of the 15th century, before we start getting law in an early version of English. And it stipulates those gardiens, les gardiens de la peace, the second part, 4 per county, of men of substance and of prestige. Again, elected by honest men of the county, men most sufficient that dwell within the shire. And then in the mid to late 15th century, we've got a series of acts that mention Louth in particular in 1455, 56 and 65. There's acts relating to RD, that the Port Reeve, which is the equivalent of a mayor, the sort of chief executive of the town, so to speak, should be a Justice of the Peace there. An act that the Port Reeves of RD again be Justices of the Peace and also Clerks of the Market. And then an act that John, the Archbishop of Armagh, may appoint a deputy in his office as Warden of the Peace for Uriel and Louth. And those 3 acts to me say something in particular. Usually if a piece of legislation is stipulating an action to be undertaking, there's a necessity to bring about that office is not being filled up to this point, or that I think it's probably a sign that the traditional way of seeing a re-Gaelicization of Ireland at the end of the medieval period, and we're seeing this sort of contraction of the English state and the contraction of English influence into what Sparky Booker calls the 4 loyal shires of Ireland: Meath, Louth, Dublin and Kildare, and that even within some of those counties, the borders are coming perilously close to the core. Like the Pale at its smallest probably comes to Maynooth, which is really very close to Dublin City, if you're looking at it on a map. And to me, those acts are suggesting that office has not been filled, or not being filled adequately in parts of Meath, in parts of Louth, which I think are undoubtedly coming under pressure at the end of the medieval period. In 1495, importantly, English public legislation, as I mentioned already, has been transferred over to Ireland in toto. And there's a number of acts that are passed on the English statute books that therefore become law within Ireland as well about how we regulate this office. By 1634 to 5, we've got another act mentioned again. We get little in the legislation in the 16th century, but an act for ease in pleading against troublesome and contentious suits presented against sheriffs, justice peace, mayors, constables, and certain other officers for the lawful execution of their office. Essentially, people are bringing what we call malicious suits against government officers within the law courts. The legislation has stipulated that these are troublesome and contentious, there for the purposes of slowing down their actions to sort of try and slow down those which are held by evil and dispossessed contentious persons. And then finally another act appointing an order of justice peace, touching bailment, committing and taking of examination of prisoners, just tightening bail procedures, making the country a little bit safer. It's remarkable how much what politicians say today about the law and crime and, make Ireland safe and getting tough on crime and these sorts of issues replicate themselves several hundred years back. One of the best ways, I think, to understand how the law works, how justices of the peace work in Ireland, and even just understanding exactly what the law is to make use of a book like this, The Justice of the Peace for Ireland, consisting of 2 books. It's written by a guy called Richard Bolton. At the time he's writing, he's a Baron of the Exchequer in the Central Courts in Dublin. He later on becomes Lord Chancellor. He's tried himself for treason. He's not convicted in Parliament. But in addition to a sterling legal career, and he's a very well-paid lawyer, and he does very well within the state, both the combination of political subservience to his political masters in the 1620s and 1630s, but also, I think, a prodigious talent and a great writer of books. He spends a lot of time researching, or as I suspect may be the case, is paying other people to research on the history of the statutes of Ireland. He publishes one of the very earliest versions of that in the 1620s. But for me, and for what I use the most, is his very accessible book on the Justices of the Peace for Ireland, which is literally a how-to guide of how to do your job. You know those big yellow books that you see in Eason's, The Internet's Guide for Dummies, or How to Fix Your Car for Dummies, or the equivalent of the YouTube video. If you're like me, you've got a glue gun and a drill and you're trying to figure out how to fit a light onto the wall without electrocuting myself. This sort of book is fulfilling the exact same role. Now, 2 things are interesting. First of all, the book in itself to me is a fascinating read through. Now, I studied criminology. I'm not a criminal lawyer. I know a little bit about the law, same as everybody else in the room, I imagine. We all know more or less what the law is made up of. There'll be some finer points that we may not know fairly well. But for me, a book like this, which is published, I think, for the first time in 1638, is a fascinating read, because the very fact that you need to publish a book like this, to my mind, says something about early plantation Ireland. Okay? We're still, at this point, only about 30 years into the Ulster plantation. The Munster plantation started a few decades before, but it collapses almost instantaneously during the Ulster Rebellion of the 1590s. So Ireland is still getting itself back on its feet. And I think a book like this is made for the new plantation population. So what plantation means, the Anglicisation of Ireland, ultimately means that, in addition to many other things, Catholics need to be removed from posts of influence. So by 1607, the last Catholic judge is out of the civil courts. Catholic officers within the army are being increasingly excluded. Rank and file probably still belong in there to a point. And certainly local figures in the community need to be reliable, by which I mean politically reliable, and I think also sort of reliable in terms of their ethnicity and importantly in their religion as well. Now, what we know is that in certain parts of Ireland, there's not all that many Protestants around, particularly in rural parts, particularly the further west you go. Okay? So a lot of the people who are being appointed into the role of a justice of the peace, a local policing figure, somebody with authority, somebody who can read and write, who understand the basic principles of law, who can interact with central government, warrants being sent up and down, those sorts of things. Now, what's probably happening is that there's a lot of people who aren't inherently suitable for the role being appointed. In a more settled country like England, a good chance the local justice of the peace, father was a justice of the peace. her grandfather was Justice of the Peace, that there's a lot to be said. I know it's not popular to say today, where we live in a world of meritocracy, apparently, but think of all the TDs whose father was TDs. And you can say, God, that seems very unreasonable. How do they keep getting elected? The simple fact of the matter is that they learn their political education at home, handing out leaflets, going out canvassing as a kid. And that works the same, I think, with figures like Justices of the Peace. But as the new, fresh off the boat, English and Scots are arriving into Ireland, they have new money and new wealth, but they don't have the kind of heritage within their family to undertake these offices and to perform the actions that's necessary. So they need, therefore, a guide like this book, The Justice of the Peace, which is literally a two-part book that will explain to you in no uncertain terms what your job is, what the law is, and how to fill out all the forms. So in the first book here on the left side, it literally states, this is your job, these are your rights, this is what you are required to do. And then it goes through all the various sorts of offences that you can be committing in Ireland and come to the attention of local law enforcement. So it literally goes down to affray, armour, arrest, the posse comitatus, where you gather some locals to help you out, advice to justices, taking bail, some civil law issues around the regulation of the local countryside, done usually in tandem with what becomes the grand jury soon afterwards around things like bridge building, road building, maintenance of highways, that sort of thing. But then down into felonies by the common law, the difference between murder and manslaughter, who's chargeable with homicide, who's not, death by misadventure, homicide upon necessity, killing somebody in self-defence, down into robbery, larceny, theft. We all think we know the difference between robbery, larceny and theft. Some people don't always know the difference between burglary and theft, things like that, Things that we know it's all taking somebody else's property, but there's certain circumstances. Burglary, for instance, is entering somebody's home to remove their goods. It was only a nighttime offence in the early modern period. Nowadays, obviously, it's a 24 hours offence. And it takes us down all of these, down into the 50s and 60s, to things like unlawful games, playing Sunday sports, for example, rough games, cork bans, hurling in 1631 within the precincts of the city, for example. It's seen as too rough a sport. Down to things like hunting, night walking, purveyors, riots, routs, unlawful assemblies, all those sorts of things. And then down to things like robbery and some very interesting stuff down this end around issues like social control, particularly within the urban area. Things around like poverty, rogues, vagabonds and beggars, controlling urban society, the fear of the urban poor, because they lead to disorder, because they're thought to lead to disease, because it's unsettling to society. Remember, society is still a very staid sort of a place in the early modern period. Everybody knows everybody in the locality. And if your local town is sort of descended upon by, in many cases, starving people from the countryside who are desperate and go towards the towns for work or for food, that is terrifying to the locals within the town. And so it's no surprise to us that in the 1630s we see the first act in Ireland for the establishment of houses of correction, which are a sort of a halfway house between, it's sort of a social control, poverty control and local crime control establishment where people can be locked away simply for being poor as such, and they're put to work as part of this process. And a lot of the kind of concepts, and we probably use the same today if we're willing to accept it in our heads, even if we don't say it out loud, ideas around deserving poor and undeserving poor, and who deserves to get our charity and who doesn't, and who are just simply lazy along those processes. And so I think a book like this is really important in this regard, to establish this within early modern Ireland, that the people who are expected to undertake these jobs, who are expected to control local society, who are expected to make sure that the King's law is obeyed in the localities, needs a how-to book. That in itself, to my mind, is very interesting about who's being appointed to this in this process. The second part of the book is fascinating as well, There's a brilliant list of offences and what the punishments are. There's just a long line of offences for execution. I think probably the execution, even though in theory the law allows for it, probably has not been carried out nearly as much as we would have thought, or as we sometimes might like to think. In a nationalist history of Ireland and English law, we like to emphasise just how violent the law can be. I think in reality, though, it's not been carried out nearly as much. And then in the second part of that book, it's essentially a mass plagiarism project, because it gives you all of the Latin warrants that you would need as a justice of the peace. Because again, I think these are probably less educated men than would traditionally be the case who are undertaking this role. They don't know Latin, so it's literally, this is what you write on the sheet if you're bailing somebody. This is what you write on the sheet if you're bringing somebody before a magistrate for such and such an offence. This is what you write on the page if you're keeping somebody in jail until the justice of the assize come around. And the very fact that they need a book like that, to my mind, is very interesting. Like I say, there's 151 pages of warrants where they're literally told, just copy this out and put in their name here and put in your name there, you know, which is in itself, I think, pretty fascinating stuff. According to Sir Richard Bolton, who writes the book, he insists that a justice of the peace should be a man of ability, both of body and estate, so be physically capable of doing the job. And in Louth, it's an easy role, but in bigger counties like Galway, Cork is a huge county. Like they're considering to split it in two in the early 17th century. They don't in the end. But I mean, even today, it's 4 hours drive to go from far down in West Cork all the way up to somewhere like Fermoy or somewhere up that way, you know. So be of ability of body and estate, and of courage and of truth and in the truth. I think to be a man of estate, you need to be able to obviously have a horse to get around the place, but you also need to be somebody who's considered respectable within the community. And I think ultimately that's somebody who's got a decent sized house, a decent estate, and who has that sort of, that sense that they belong in that role and that they can undertake with some sort of authority the king's work. They must be men fearing of God and not seeking the place for honour or commodity, nor respecting person but the cause. They must be men dealing truly, searching out all the truth, and hating covetousness. They must judge the people at all seasons, using all diligence in hearing and ending causes, and not to neglect the public for private employment. And there's, like every early modern book, many biblical quotations as to why that's a good idea. Ultimately, they must have respectability, they must have intelligence, they must have a physical ability. It's essential that they are literate. That's not a given in early modern Ireland. It's not necessarily a sign of people who are not prosperous on the basis that they're not illiterate. They must have some knowledge of the law, and this book solves that problem for them. They must have administrative ability, and they must have leadership ability. In many cases, the local justice of the peace will have underlings, people like a parish constable, constables of the watch. And these people may be illiterate people. These are the sort of guys who are actually walking around maybe with a lighted torch, keeping an eye in the area, grabbing malefactors and people like that. But I think a really important question to ask is, how does it work in early modern Ireland? Okay, what does respectability mean? How do you amass your wealth? How are you somebody who is recognised in, I want to say the community, but what's probably more accurate is the communities, because Ireland is not a homogenous space in the early modern period. Okay, we have Catholics, we have Anglicans or Church of Ireland people, we have a very high concentration of Presbyterians, particularly in the northeast, but in other parts of Ireland as well. Post 1649, after Cromwell's time, we get a lot of people who are much further down the spectrum than the Presbyterians are. The Quakers, the Independents, the Congregationalists. So in terms of religion, it is not homogenous. In terms of ethnicity, it is not homogenous. Catholics in the 1640s, albeit under extreme pressure, engage occasionally in civil war against each other at the end of the 1640s. Officially, or in theory, on the same side. The Gaelic Irish and the Old English do not necessarily get on. They are eventually moving towards a place, probably not there until the late 17th, maybe even the early 18th century, where they think of themselves simply as Irish. By the start of our period in the 1400s or the 1500s, there is a genuine mistrust and sometimes an outright hostility and hatred between the Old English. Those are the descendants of the Anglo-Normans, people who are present in places like County Louth in great strength, and the Gaelic Irish, who might be sometimes just 20 miles up the road in Armagh or parts of Cavan or Monaghan, and who have many, many, many generations of discord between those two communities. So how will it work when you implant a new law in Ireland? Remember, before Henry VIII's time, the English colony is essentially 4 counties around Dublin, basically, from Dundalk down to Bray, and stretching out, maybe taking in places like Navan or just a little bit beyond the RD maybe, but not much further beyond that. Relatively speaking, a small place. And within the space of about 20 or 30 years, by say 1603, the entire island is now part of the Kingdom of Ireland. The state and the geographical entity are the same thing at this point. So all of a sudden there's huge swathes of Ireland that have all of a sudden become part of the English state, where English law has to be administered. So how will it work when somebody from outside, who has no heritage in the county, who's not well known, who may be in your mind, and possibly with good reason to believe this, who may be somebody who's just arrived out of nowhere and all of a sudden been awarded 10,000 acres, who all of a sudden has been held up to you as this is now the gentry figure or the junior aristocrat within your district. You need to obey these people. These may be people who are expressing a large amount of disgust at the way you live in your community, the way you farm, the way you wear your hair, whether you have a mustache or not, the way that you have intimate relations with your partner in life, all sorts of aspects of your life and your livelihood, how you farm, how you make money, how you talk, how you worship, who may be actively harassing members of your religious community, that those people have to sort of make an effort at enforcing law and doing so with respectability at its heart. You know, the lack of homogeneity within an Irish society in the 16th or the 17th century surely means that this sort of a role is a very different one to do. In a homogeneous country, like say lowland Scotland or large parts of England, everybody speaks the same language. Everybody in England, we think maybe about 1 or 2% of the population of England remains Catholic once we get into the middle of the 17th century. So outside of London, which has got a nice mix of people, outside of London, most people in England speak the same language, have a largely similar religion, and probably have a general sense of themselves as English people. But in Ireland, different ethnicities, different religions, different languages, different religious traditions that come along the way. Within Ireland, the rural J.P.s are appointed by a commission out of Chancery, whilst the urban officers, like the Port Reeve of Ardee, who I mentioned earlier, were J.P.s by right of charter, so they don't lose their status on the death of a monarch, which the former might do. J.P.s, importantly, have to make an oath as Justice of the Peace and the oath of supremacy, although it's not always fully enforced. Now, the oath of supremacy is different to an oath of allegiance. An oath of allegiance simply says, I swear to be true to and faithful to my monarch, and I'll execute my office diligently and adequately. An oath of supremacy is a religious test. It requires you to acknowledge, in this case Elizabeth I, but later on her descendants, that you have to acknowledge them not just as your king and swear fealty to them, but also acknowledge them as the supreme governor of the church. It's a religious test. And any Catholic who takes the religion seriously, and ultimately somebody who takes the salvation of their soul seriously, and most people do in the early modern period, that ultimately they would not be willing to take this test. So that oath of supremacy is a religious test saying Catholics need not apply. And later on, it's also saying, by the way, Presbyterians need not apply. We never really think of Presbyterians as being victims of penal laws, but they are kept out of town governance on the basis of things like oaths of supremacy, which do not allow these people into office. And it keeps a sort of Anglican elite within Ireland that lasts up until well into the 19th century. That's just one of the loud references that I have there, the middle one. That's That's from the reign of Henry IV, so 1399. That's about 1412. That one is taken. That's another one that's appointing somebody very significant, the Earl of Tyrconnell, before he flees off to, before he goes off to Spain as part of the flight of the Earls. Significant peers are regularly appointed as J.P.s, and as I'm going to point out now in a minute, so too are bishops and clergy as well as part of this process. And I'll tell you why I think that might be happening to a point. In terms of benefits, there's an enhancement, I think, of prestige and power within this, that local people, particularly if you're social climbing, particularly if you've got wealth, what my mum would call a sort of a rough diamond, a little bit of snobby thing to say, somebody who's got money but doesn't yet have all the refinements of money, somebody who's come into money more recently and wants to show how well they're doing by taking on an office like this, that loyal service might actually enhance their power, and that it might in fact lead to favour and advancement into the future. When active on duty, there's 4 shillings a day to be made, which is not to be sniffed at, I think. Whether they're always paid on time, I'm not quite sure. And this is taken, which is obviously quite problematic, from the fines and the amercements at these sessions. Nobles aren't allowed to claim the wage. When you're taking the wages of the enforcement from the fines, obviously there's an effort in those things to make sure that you keep fining people if you want to keep your income coming in. It's like the problem, we don't do it in Ireland, but in other countries where your NCT is tested by the same people who will do the repairs on your car, you're never going to trust. Or if the dentist keeps on saying you need this, you need this, you need this done. If an error, he can excuse himself as an honest mistake. There are occasions though, and they make for very interesting reading, when we go to things like the Court of Star Chamber. It's what it gets called sometimes now, the Court of Castle Chamber is its proper name, where officers of the state who have been found to be corrupt or negligent are sometimes brought and prosecuted within this court. It's seen generally as a very unpopular court politically in Ireland at the time. Personally, I like it because it's a non-jury court and it's made up of a mixture of judges and politicians, but it's a way sometimes to get at powerful people in society where juries won't be able to prosecute or won't be willing to prosecute on the basis that the powerful men who own half of the county, a jury won't find against them because they're so reliant on them and so scared of their power within that process. The responsibilities, as I've been sort of pointing out, are, some of them may not have been as prominent in the early modern period, things that we associate with the work of the grand jury later on. Justices of the peace become sort of local figures like people who sit on boards of poor law guardians and things like that in the 19th century. But they are that sort of officer who take on those sorts of local responsibilities of administration. Even as late as the 17th century, there is still some supervision of things like local administration, local taxation, the building of the public roads, bridges, the maintenance of the highways, standards of cloth being produced. Some of these regulations are coming in from England. Some of them are quite specific to Ireland as well. Very important, I think, is the appointment and supervision of the local constables and the local watch, where again, the J.P. will sit at the local courts as a judicial figure, never with the power to execute. The local quarter sessions, as a general rule, they can inflict incarceration, fines, corporal punishment, but never capital punishment. And shame punishments, I think, are an important part of their thing as well. So they have a judicial function, but also a sort of a policing function. They have to keep the peace in the county. They detect crime and apprehend criminals, up to and including treasons, the latter representing many of the regular crimes, as I mentioned before, such as things like murder or agricultural arson. They hold the quarter sessions, these local hearings held 4 times a year, hearing misdemeanours. In many respects, they're the most fascinating sort of cases if you want to come to an understanding of what urban life was like in Ireland back in the day. There's lots of really interesting cases if you can get your hands on some of the trial records that are coming through in terms of what people are doing. They're playing an awful lot, I think, in these quarter sessions with the supervisions of the constables. I think they're doing a huge amount of work of social control. And this is why I think there's a strong link, particularly once Ireland starts to settle in the mid-17th century onwards. I think they're doing a huge amount of Anglicisation work and civilization work, of making the Irish peasantry and the Irish urban poor well behaved, of trying to put manners on them. Do you know, I would often tell my students, whilst the Anglican state, which includes Anglican clergy, have an avowed and express mission to civilise Ireland, I'd also argue that Catholic clergy are doing almost exactly the same thing. If you read, for instance, Vera Moyne's brilliant 2-volume letters from the Jesuit annual reports that Jesuit communities send back to Rome every single year, it's full of instances of trying to take Catholics away from these quarter sessions, civil cases being heard, the fear of the Catholic flock going to what they consider the heretic courts, but that when they bring them into their own sort of community of sort of kind of punishment and penance for misdemeanors within the local community, they're trying to do exactly the same thing. They're trying to bring European standards, because remember, these clergy are increasingly being educated on the continent, or at least the bishops and the senior clergy are, and what they're really trying to do is trying to civilise the Irish community, to make it a little bit less violent, to regulate sexual manners and morals especially, because the Gaelic kind of heritage in Ireland around particularly property which is held in community more so than primogeniture, which is held by the individual, by the eldest son. The importance of knowing who your eldest son is less important. And if you read something like Diarmaid MacCulloch's most recent book on Christianity and sexual morality, it's really interesting because he has a good look at Ireland in this sense. And a lot of the Bull Laudabiliter, which essentially is a document by the papacy in the mid-12th century saying why Ireland should be taken over by the English, I think one of the big issues in there is that there's a recognition that Ireland is out of kilter with the rest of mainstream European society. And I think probably the Catholic Church plays a big part in this civilization process. It's kind of another half to this sort of talk, you know, on the other side. As I say, Dublin is not on the circuit because it's got the central courts there, but J.P.s could have greater responsibilities there and could in theory be hearing felonies and treasons, though I think for the most part they probably didn't. And we push then towards clergy as justices of the peace. Now again, this is not typical. If Ireland is ideally going to be a replication of England, and it never can be, it's extremely naive of people at the time to think that you could just wave a magic wand, pass a few acts, and that the culture and society and even the environment and the landscape of Ireland could be changed so easily. But what happens is, again, we might ask ourselves, why would the Irish Parliament in the 1640s, when they're complaining to England, when they know that there's going to be a big renegotiation of power, not just in Ireland, but across the three kingdoms, and just before all the civil wars begin, that they humbly desire that His Majesty will be graciously pleased to give order that from henceforth none of the assigned justices of the peace, but persons of good ability, both in their estates and their endowments and knowledge and experience. That's first of all the complaint, that the people you're appointing to this role aren't suitable. And then number two, that no ecclesiastical persons be made justices of the peace, nor drawn aside from attending the pastoral functions by following temporal employments. Now why in the name of God, why would you be appointing clergy as justices of the peace in Ireland? Again, I think there's a twofold reason to this. Number one, out in the far west of, say, Connacht, in near Connacht, out in Connemara, how many local Protestants are there? Very few. How many local Protestants are there who can read and write and would have the time and the wealth and the experience and the legal knowledge to undertake this role? Very few. Who are guaranteed by the nature of their employment and their role to be able to undertake a role which involves administrative ability, the ability to read and write? Clergy. Who have a lot of time on their hands because there's no Protestants living in the area, but yet have the income that actually allows them to be in place, because the clergy are supported by the state, they're supported by a tithe. So again, clergy become part of that process. So what we see in Ireland, but what we don't see in England, is clergy in place in a policing function in Ireland for a very long time in the early modern period, which I didn't expect to see. But once I started digging, I actually started to come across quite a lot of examples of this going on. That's 1641. where the Irish Parliament is saying this is not a good idea. In 1774, okay, 130 something years afterwards, Daniel Carthy, Cornelius Carthy and Dennis Carthy, three brothers commonly called the Doves, were taken out of the South Jail on Friday the 22nd, this is in Cork, and executed on Saturday 33rd of April for different burglaries and felonies. One of these miscreants killed the Reverend Mr. Moore when he was going to apprehend them. That's a clergyman in 1774, later 18th century, going out on a horse trying to apprehend criminals out around Cork. That, to my mind, is very interesting. That's a very strange one. Just on top of it, by the way, if you're interested, John Rowan was executed at Middleton on Saturday, 16th of April, 1774, for the murder of Abigail Kennelly, his sweetheart. And the media hasn't changed much in its portrayal of people who commit, family annihilation and things like that, of the sort of identifying people by things like, he was big in the local GA community and he's a good teacher and all this sort of thing. On the other side, these letters are just up the road, by the way, in the Robinson Library. It's a brilliant library. If you haven't been up to visit, make it worth your while. It's fantastic. This is Anthony Dopping, the Lord Bishop of Meath, who becomes a very significant figure within the church. To the Keeper of His Majesty's Jail of the said county, and in the course of that letter, he basically arrests a local school teacher in Navan, a Catholic school teacher. This is in 1680, what year is it? 1686, is it? 1686. So the Catholics are getting uppity because James II is coming onto the throne. But it's really interesting that he's arresting him. Now, bishops do have the authority to license school ministers, but it's very clear from that warrant that he is acting as a justice of the peace and incarcerating a schoolmaster for teaching without a license for the period of 3 months imprisonment at this time. Again, an active role, and as far as I can see, they're actually involved in collaring them. They're not just sitting in their study telling somebody to go and arrest somebody. I think they're actually involved on a day-to-day basis as part of this process. Do you know, which again I found very interesting, and I think that the idea behind it is part and parcel of that civilizing mission, part and parcel of the ability to read and write and know a little bit about the law, and also to a certain extent, for some of them at least, and with the last example I'm going to show you, this is the Bishop of Killala, now Killala is way out west. It's County Mayo, isn't it? I can tell you for certain, in the 1670s, there's very few Protestant families around. He spends most of his time, as you can see in the top left figure there, he spends most of his time looking out, not just for Tories, which is a byword, it's where the word for the political party comes from today. It basically, it's a term of abuse in the English Parliament. It comes from the Irish word Toraha, which means something like kind of a brigand, castle rustler, kind of highwayman, not a reputable character. And he's forever looking out for Tories, but also here, as he says, the Scotch presbyters who ramble up and down and debauch the people in their religion and their loyalty, which are so much more dangerous than Tories, as our souls are more precious than our goods. That's a really interesting statement to make. This is what I've been trying to explain to students in an awful lot of time. For the Anglican elite within Ireland, particularly after the execution of Charles I, he's a God-given man, he's a king. Now, killing civilians in Portadown, throwing them off a bridge is one thing. Killing a king is taken as so much more seriously. And in the aftermath of the 1650s, for a lot of Anglicans, the Scotch Presbyterians are bigger enemies than the Catholics might be. But it's very interesting that he spends a lot of his time writing letters saying, there's trouble here, there's trouble here, there's trouble here. Very few of his letters are saying, I'm spending a lot of time reading the Bible, or I'm spending a lot of time baptizing people, or converting people. So really interesting to me, though, is there's a series of communications in the late 1670s where he says, it's my duty to let your excellency know that here, which concerns the public, 3 of those 4 Tories which so long harassed this poor country have lately been cut off. That doesn't mean cut off to connections or family or anything else. I mean, they're actually cut off. One of them, a little before Candlemas, came to an Irishman's house to make an end of Christmas, but by the stoutness of his new host, Christmas made an end of him. Taking his time, when he laid by his arms, He seized upon him without any other helper, and then calling to others near for his assistance, they bound him and brought him hither, where his head was chopped off. And 3 years later, the Otway, the Bishop of Killala, is looking to get further east to a more lucrative see, and he has his heart set on Ossory, which is the Kilkenny area, the diocese around Kilkenny. And the son of the Duke of Ormond, who's the Lord Lieutenant, and his son is a fairly influential figure, is heart set against it. I've since the writing of my letter of this day's date spoke to some of your best friends concerning the promotion of the Bishop of Killala. They are all of the opinion that appearing for this unhappy prelate, who I term so since he could do so exorbitant a thing as without law to execute a man. The Bishop of Killala had a Tory brought in to his kitchen, we know this from several different sources, and said, take his head off. And the man's head was chopped off in his kitchen right in front of him. They took out a sword. There's no act. He's acting here as a justice of the peace, as a local authority. But again, to my mind, it's a very stark description of the activities of clergy around about the time, but also the fact that they're acting within that role. And I don't know, I'm not sure if it's scary or not to us now. We know lots of things about this. There's another description again of his head being cut off in the house. As he's brought in a prisoner, he's unarmed, he's not struggling, he's not trying to escape, he's not a threat to them, he's bound. And they have him executed on the spot. And he is, in the end, appointed as Bishop of Ossory along that line, which is unheard of. This is what Ormond's son, the Earl of Ossory, is saying to his father. This man is inherently unsuitable. This is the last sort of a guy that you should be appointing. And if this were in England, there was no chance that he'd even make it to be parish clergy, not to mind a bishop. And there's still people writing letters afterwards. Killala is very pious, virtuous and charitable, but not much acquainted with the business of the world. If that's not much acquainted with the business of the world, I'm not sure what could be. This, to my mind, like I say, is just this encapsulates what's so very strange about early modern Ireland. And this idea of creating a little England or a little Britain to the west. By this stage now, we're kind of 130, 140 years since the creation of the Kingdom of the Island. We're 70 years into the Ulster Plantation. Ireland should be settled. We've got all the benefits of civilization and Protestantization and Anglicisation. We've all learned how to use a knife and fork and stuff like this. And yet still, this is, by the way, is the English state. This is the Anglican Church. This is an Anglican bishop. And the big irony, this is what I try to hammer home with students all the time, in creating a civilized Ireland, the state, that's the English state, is doing very barbaric things. In order to civilize us, they're brutalizing us. And that's the big irony of the project. And that's what a lot of people don't say out loud at the time. And that, I think, to a certain degree, is what a lot of historians don't always want to talk about either, is that it's a very barbaric century, and it's a very brutal century, and it's a deeply violent century. Do you know? So, to conclude, because I know I've run on far too long, I think very clearly the office is important. It's a really important feature of local justice. Now, I'm still working on it, I'm still trying to understand it and the exact role that it has, but to my mind it seems a critical interface between central government, which is professional lawyers and legislators and administrators, central government and a professional legal community in Dublin, and then with the local, regional, unprofessional figures who are both part of Shrieval and baronial society, but who are also tasked with controlling them. So they're Dublin Castle's man in the locality saying, you need to get control of this area. You need to take the beast out of the locals. In the early modern period of Reformation, of plantation, of expropriation, and of a growing ethnic and religious hatred, which is surely the mark of an uncivilized society that's becoming less civilized, the office and the role of the law in the localities takes on a really important influence, much greater than might originally be expected. Do you know, that local interface where a local society may be all Irish speaking, may not know any English people, may never have met an English person or a Scot or a Welshman, and all of a sudden has somebody coming down from Dublin or from Shropshire or from Kent and just landing in, West Clare or North Sligo or the rough part of Donegal, and just saying locally, I'm in charge now and you need to start behaving like they do back in England. Primarily, this is because the nature of community and the lack of homogeneity within it will naturally affect the way that the community view the individual who's come to police them, the better person of their society, but also how they view a criminal justice system and how the criminal justice system also views them. Because those reports will occasionally go back to Dublin saying, terrible trouble here with the locals, the natives are revolting and all that, in every sense of the word and all that sort of thing. So I think that's all I've got to say on the matter.